specifically?
Thank you so much for this question. And just to start us off, number one, we only have a little bit of time. So I'm going to give it something very brief to talk about reparations. But I really want to lift that reparations is a really five-pillar structure that comes from the community of impacted people. So the first one means a process of guarantees of non-repetition. So reparations is about a reparative process. So there's been some sort of harm, and the first pillar is to make sure that we stop the harm. And so giving a cannabis context, that means full decriminalization, that means descheduling. And then we have rehabilitation, which is our second pillar. That can look more like health services. It can look like mental health supports, that sort of thing, more of a clinical piece. And then we also have a restitution, which means in the word that we take people back to where they were in positions in their lives prior to the harm. And the cannabis aspect, the way that we do that the most is by sealing records, as well as like post incarceration or post harm types of services to support people. And we know we'll never actually probably get people back to where they really were. And so the fourth pillar is satisfaction. So what else needs to happen to create a satisfaction to really repair the harm? A lot of times what we see in a more systemic community pieces, these might be apologies or different services that meets the needs of the harm that was done. And the fifth one is the one that everyone kind of knows and can and speak out to. That's the compensation, right? So we have guarantees of non-repetition, rehabilitation, restitution, satisfaction, and compensation. I mentioned this as a process because I think my ancestors specifically have done a really good job of when we say reparations in this Western context, we think about reparations for chattel slavery. But when you ask why, what is the case for reparations with cannabis, I really say, why not? And when we think about how many different successful reparations cases there are, I think that's when we can see our movement also fitting in there. So we have like the Navajo Hopi Rehabilitation Act of 1950, which earmarked $88.5 million. Right here in Virginia, we had a reparations project approved for the sterilization cases that were happening in Virginia. Chicago has an example of the Chicago Police Torture Act. And then across the international space, we know about Holocaust survivors, as well as even more recently in Colombia, they have millions of dollars that's going to go out over a decade. And so reparations projects and services are actually happening right now. And so when we talk about cannabis, why not? We've seen the harms. We can talk more about those harms, but when we see and know what people have suffered from cannabis prohibition, I think it's very clear about why reparations is something that needs to take a hold in our movement.
So you touched on this briefly, but I'm wondering if you can tell us briefly what the harms, or tell us more about the harms of prohibition on communities of color in particular.
Correct. And so, I like to always take us back to the beginning and the foundation, right? So, in this US context, we're also always connecting what we're seeing right now to a living tentacle of US enslavement. And that's when people, it starts to get very heavy, but we need to touch on it to know where we've come. And even after emancipation, with that type of exception of the 13th Amendment, we were able to then redefine who we can enslave with the word convict. And then that took on who else fits this new definition of who can be enslaved. What is the new convict? And then we know that in 1970s, our particular government here took that word and expanded the industrial prison complex by really doubling down on cannabis prohibition and creating this infrastructure with the DEA, the CSA, and now just like we had an institution of enslavement, we have now this institution of prohibition that has continued the work there. And so when we talk about people of color and that harm, just number one, being able to tie it back to what some folks might call an original sin, but now realizing that it's more than people that have African descent that's now caught up in the harms of cannabis prohibition. It reaches far beyond that. And so that just talks more about a prison industrial complex, mass incarceration that from that era that we talk about. We've also had what we say are collateral consequences, which are barriers to housing, employment, education, and now we also have deportation, which is a much heavier consequences than something we say collaterally, right? And so it's still being very much used locally and nationally for people of color specifically. And I'll just end this part by saying that we now know on record that the US government knew that they were lying about the harms of cannabis and were using it specifically on certain groups that include poor people, hippies, people of a certain political mind frame, right? People of African descent and also Latinos. And so we've seen this new way of harm that they have put on us that we're still battling for right now, that yes, touches the people of color, but now reaches all corners of our society.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll stick with you for just a couple more questions on reparations. Can you tell us, in an ideal world, what would these reparations look like and how would they work?
Oh, this is such a question that invites us to dream and really imagine. And I say that that's because number one, we get to figure out what we want to demand for our harms while also learning from other people's movements around reparations. And so the earlier examples that I gave, I always try to give those when we start to answer this question of what does it look like to us so that we can see something expansive. But I would say that we really need to, number one, look at repealing the prohibition completely, right? That repetition of the guarantees of non-repetition means no more. We have to stop it. So before we even start to continue to dream about the process, we've got to stop all of that harm and leave no one behind. And then we also have to have official legislative intent and whatever bill, resolution, pieces of government or from particular institutions. I think the call for reparations has to also be in writing, like say it with your chest. Like what is the legislative intent behind whatever reparations are coming, right? And then that's when we start to say, well, what's coming? Hey, we've got new funds and revenue. Well, where is that going? We've got some types of services. Where are those going? And that's when we really are then I love what Chicago did is they actually created a center for people to be able to go and get some of their trauma treated because it was police torture. So it was a direct link to the harm that was done. And they were saying, this is what our people need. And so when we talk about what reparations could look like in cannabis, I think that we need to look at the holistic harms. And that means the criminal justice side, the public health side, understanding that this has been a community impact as well, and just be able to dream of what we could do strategically as well as like what could that really mean of covering housing for people, transportation for people that get out, and not just set them free and not allow them to fully participate, right? So I think that there's a lot that we could do to dream, but I think first we need to have it written out. What were all the harms? What were the ways? And then we can work from there to get people back to where they can be happy and hopefully less criminalized.
Yeah, totally. And finally, to wrap up, what hasn't worked in reparations organizing?
Yeah, and one other thing I just see in my notes because I was just talking and not scrolling. I think something else I really wanted to take from Chicago too was a new education curriculum. Like we talk about DARE a lot, and there are some other options for education around drug use and cannabis. And I think that's one of the pieces too that could really be part of reparations from a community level, right? As hitting that transformatively. But looking at what has not worked. And a lot of these might sound very familiar to other movements because they happen everywhere, not just in reparations. But there's going to be some infighting with the people that have the demands, right? So that has not worked. When we've struggled through it and we've come forward, folks have been really able to get folks moving forward. I think too is that honestly, when white supremacy, when narratives of the oppressor really get the forward facing headline, then it works against reparations, right? So when we don't have a strategy to be able to fight the larger narrative to where a lot of people won't even say the word reparations, they don't want anything to do with it. And so I think it's been on us that when it hasn't worked is that sometimes we haven't done that narrative work one-to-one peers so that they can also hear themselves in this movement or at least hear why our best good is also going to be tied to their greatest good as well.
Thank you so much for your thoughts on those questions. Scott, I'll move on to you. Do you have anything you'd like to add to that? We know you have a forthcoming article about reparations. Congratulations on that. Do you mind talking a bit about that paper? What does your scholarship focus on, and why did you choose to write about this topic?
Yeah, that's a lot to jump off on. So let me start with the paper. So the paper is called Individualized Cannabis Reparations. It's forthcoming in the Texas A&M Law Review this winter. You can find a draft of it online if you just Google my name and SSRN, Social Science Research Network. You'll find a draft there. It's like 60 pages long, so just cozy up with it, a nice warm cup of coffee or something. It's a good read. The thrust of the paper is making a case for individualized cannabis reparations, right? Providing it is to Chelsea's point, right? Reparations needs to be viewed holistically. My paper does focus on the financial component and making the case that financial component is not logistically impractical, politically infeasible, or financially impractical either, which are kind of some of the main objections that you'll see to individualized reparations programs for drug offenders in the legal and other social science literature. So I'm going to unpack that argument, but just first, like as to why I wanted to write about this, I like my interest in cannabis law is somewhat academic. Like I think it's a very interesting area of law, but it is also very much focused on the social equity angle of cannabis law and the imperative that the industry has to make right for the wrongs of the past. To me, that is what's special and unique about this area of law, that there is a social justice component to it. And when I'm, sitting down and reading a lot of the academic literature in this space, and they talk about reparations, they're really talking about group reparations, right? Like community reinvestment programs, which I think are very important. Or they're talking about business licensing benefits, right? Making sure that the cannabis industry is reflective of the people who were most hurt by cannabis prohibition. And that's very important too. But I see that as a little bit of an incomplete picture because many people who were convicted of cannabis offenses or who were incarcerated for cannabis offenses even, they may not want to open a cannabis business. And they may not live in the areas that are getting community reinvestment funds, or if they do live in those areas, they may not benefit from the various uses of those funds. And so I wanted to make the case that we need individualized reparations payments to supplement, right, to complement and complete that overall social equity picture. I just want to touch on, I guess, the kind of high level objections that I think people sometimes have to individualized reparations. And the first is like that it's like a pie in the sky idea that can never happen, and like it's not logistically possible to track down like every person who's been arrested or convicted for a cannabis offense, and it'll never work politically in like that kind of bucket of arguments. And I think a lot of these arguments are like an instinctual reaction to the idea that there's just so much injustice in this space that it's too hard to fix, right? And I think that's kind of true if you think of this as a top-down problem where there would be one federally run reparations program where the federal government would have to track down every single person in the country who's been impacted by cannabis prohibition, and like that does seem like a monumental task, right? But if you think of this as a bottom-up project where localities and states are establishing cannabis reparations programs, I think that the task becomes much more logistically and politically feasible. Logistically, it's a lot easier for cities and states to track down people with cannabis convictions at a local or state level than to have a singular national program. Politically, it's not going to be viable everywhere, right? That's just the reality. But in many of the places where cannabis prohibition hit communities the hardest, support for a reparations program is going to be better than like the national average, right? In compared to like a national top-down program. And like, thanks, I would just want to call out and thank Chelsea for raising a point to me when we spoke, when I was doing research on my paper, where she mentioned that thinking of it as a local initiative is like so important for let's call them blue cities and red states, right? Where like at the state level, it'd be really hard to do like maybe any kind of social equity initiative, but at the local level, right, it's much more accessible. Conceiving of this as a local project also allows for variation amongst cities and states to meet local conditions, right? So like different cities might want to include different groups of people in the beneficiary class. They might want to have slightly different tax bases on how to fund this project. They might structure the payout amount differently, how much money everyone should get to provide recompense. It may prioritize payments differently, and so on. And then just like as to the financial objection to this, like I guess two things. One, we're already states and cities are already investing a lot of money in community reinvestment, as they should, and they're also putting a lot of financial and human resources into training programs and business licensing and like all sorts of very valuable programs. And like they have the money to do this. Like, look at how much money states are making from cannabis tax revenues. In the paper, I use a couple of case studies. I look at California, I look at Illinois, and just to take Illinois for a moment, like Illinois generated $500 million with a B dollars from cannabis tax revenue in fiscal year 2024. And if you just took 10% of that revenue towards an individualized reparations program, you could issue $5,000 payments to everyone with a cannabis conviction in Illinois that was expunged, which is like 35,000 people in Illinois. You could issue those payments over the course of 3.5 years, right? And that's like a pretty modest program focused on 10% using existing cannabis tax revenue. You could expand that tax base to include a tax on intoxicating hemp, for example. You could allocate more than 10%, right? The money is there to do this. So just to sum all that up, right? I think individualized reparations need to be a part of the social equity conversation in this space. I don't see them as like outlandish or infeasible or, logistically infeasible as they might seem at first blush to some people.
That's really interesting. Thank you for your thoughts on that. So this next question is for Jason. Can you talk us through some of the criminal justice repercussions of cannabis prohibition and what communities that were most impacted? And what are some of the long and short-term harms of this that you have seen in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a couple quick thoughts just on the reparations side too before I get into that. One thing that I'd like to see at the federal level, because I do work primarily at the federal level, would be number one, we have to end prohibition, but a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to actually quantify the damage done. And I think we all agree that it's going to be a ginormous number, but I do think that that is a good way to create that sort of reconstruction period that we're going to have to move on to. And I also just want to cite that Albuquerque, New Mexico has created a universal basic income program for low-income families through cannabis tax revenue. So we are doing it. That's not termed reparations, right? But a universal basic income program is about as close to it as we want to get. But when it comes to the collateral consequences of a criminal history, they are plentiful. I will say we have done tremendous work, especially in blue states, to limit the amount of collateral consequences. But traditionally, things like trying to access housing has been a huge problem for anyone that has a criminal history, specifically any kind of felony. You can be denied home loans, right? You can be denied the ability to rent a space, right? You can be denied public housing and things like that. And so housing is one of the hardest things for any family to deal with, generally speaking, right? Like even if you don't have a criminal history, finding affordable housing has been a nightmare for most of us, over the last few years, 30, 40 years. And so having additional barriers to that, both on the home ownership side, but also on the renting side, means you could end up homeless. Or your kids won't be able to go to the appropriate school that they need to go to. So I always do look at housing as both a way for us to understand the impacts of criminal justice law, criminal justice impacts on our families, but also where maybe some of the reparation dollars could go as well, right? Like if we're able to invest in housing for folks, that not only helps that individual, but it'll help their generations to come afterwards and have real assets that last over time and appreciate in value. One of the other very important ones to me as a former campaign manager is the right to vote, right? Like this is another one that over time has been used against folks that have criminal histories and saying if you have a felony, particularly a drug felony, you lose your right to vote. Now, we have made tremendous progress on that one as well, but I do think it's important to note that it isn't just sort of like your economic side of things, right? Like the criminal history can actually impact your ability to participate politically in changing the systems that impacted you, right? And so there are actually over, I think it's like the number, I'm going to say 40, but it's even higher than that, different types of criminal collateral consequences that can happen for a criminal history. So like as a student, when I was arrested back in the year 2000 as a 16-year-old student, I would have been denied financial aid to go to college. Denial of funds to be able to go to school was one of the primary impacts of a criminal history that they pushed as like, you shouldn't do drugs because if you do drugs, you can't go to college. And lucky enough, because of the activists like folks in this room or on this call, they actually changed the law that was called the Higher Education Act's Federal Aid Elimination Penalty. That was a law that said if you had a drug charge or arrest, right? It wasn't even a conviction, it was arrest or conviction, you would not be able to access Pell Grants. And Pell Grants are one of the most productive programs when it comes to allowing folks that are low income, people of color, to actually be able to access higher education. Now, luckily, some of the activists that I worked with changed that program to say you would only lose financial aid if you got in trouble while you were on financial aid. And so that meant that that switch, that very small change to the policy, meant that all the young people that were arrested in high school could now access Pell Grants. And so for me, not only was I negatively impacted by the war on drugs policy, I was positively impacted by the movement to change the policy. And so that made it very clear to me that even a small change in policy can have a huge impact on people's lives and entire communities. And so I do think that's why it's important that as we think about how we're organizing, how we're resisting, right, really using public policy as both a way to dream a bigger, better world that we can build together, but also know that you can change one small line and one small bill and radically improve the lives of millions of people. Aside from that, I think the other thing is employment, right? And so like we've had a number of campaigns around ban the box, but for decades you had to check a little box that said, have you ever been convicted of a drug crime? And so that meant employers could just outright deny you the job right away without even giving you an interview. So a lot of these programs vary from state to state. There vary their impacts at this point in time, which I think creates an even more terrible situation where we have justice by geography, where depending on where you're born, you can be radically more free and more able to move on with your life after a drug conviction than if you are somewhere else. And this is a very unfortunate situation that we're seeing now that was mentioned earlier around certain blue states having progressed significantly more on erasing some of these difficult situations, whereas our Midwest and South brothers and sisters are dealing with a very difficult time where those legislatures are unlikely to change a lot of these laws. And so we need to, as a national community, come together to figure out how we can help folks no matter where they live.
Yeah, and kind of as a follow-up to that question, or that comment, can you tell us a little about what some of the resistance to those very current events are? Anything that can and should be done to resist these harms?
Oh, there's definitely lots that can and should be done, that's for sure. Well, like I think to me, like resistance is disrupting the current state and redirecting the energies of the public towards a different future, right? And so that means we have to go beyond just having opinions, right? That means that directly intervening. And so that is either passing laws, stopping laws from getting passed, creating institutions that can help train folks, that can help heal different types of things that are moving forward. And resistance takes lots of different forms, right? But there have been a lot of second chance laws that have gone across the country that are really important. And so, there's the clean slate initiatives that have also been sort of moving across the country in various places. And I think those are all efforts that definitely should be supported and that we have precedent for, right? Like this is not something that is brand new. There's definitely language that you can use in your home state, but it is different depending on the state exactly what is feasible or not. But one of the things at the Last Prisoner Project that we do work on quite a bit is expungements. And we're really pushing for folks to start asking for state-initiated expungements rather than having the individual have to go through this long process and figure it out. If we get a lawyer, that the state governments, when we say state-initiated, it means that the government of that state is going to be the controlling body to actually move these expungements forward and not require or expect the person that was impacted to navigate the process, right? That is the biggest shift that we would like to see. Now, when it comes to cannabis, the biggest thing that I think is sort of lost on folks sometimes is there are people currently sitting in prison for activities that are now legal and generating tax revenue in that state, right? So we have folks that are serving multi-decade sentences for activities that a dispensary does in one day. And I think when we start talking about resistance, we really have to get our people out of prison, right? Like that is the biggest denial of freedom that could ever possibly be conceived. There are currently 40,000 people sitting in state prisons for cannabis charges and over 3,000 for federal charges. And that is still with half of the country having adopted adult use. So there are people that are currently in prison in a state where right down the road from the prison, they're selling cannabis. And so generally speaking, that has to be that the I want to say the only, but like one of the only ways to actually get them out is for a governor to use their clemency power to pardon them and also commute their sentences, right? And so to be clear, a pardon is saying we forgive you for having the crime that you committed. We no longer want to hold you accountable for that. However, pardons are generally for folks that are already out of prison. What we really want to see is a commutation of a sentence. And so that is where you're going to shorten the sentence of the person to time served and they're able to be let out. And so we would like to see both of those things, right? You shorten their sentence, let them out, and then pardon their charges so that they can move on with their lives. But these are the efforts at the Last Prisoner Project that we're working on. We have seen some success. Definitely different states have moved forward in different ways, but one big success we did see to kind of show the scale of what's possible. Most recently, last year, Governor Wes Moore of Maryland was able to pardon 175,000 charges, 175,000 charges that impacted just over 100,000 people in one stroke of a pen, because he chose to include not just simple possession, also paraphernalia charges, and a few other smaller infractions. And so if a governor wants to do this, they can always let folks out of prison and pardon those charges. And so it's on us to pressure those executives to do that. Same thing with the president of the United States. He can also pardon and commute the sentences of folks. So these are just some of the ways that the Last Prisoner Project really moves on resistance. But it is definitely something that is a bit ironic where we are pushing for folks to get let out of prison while at the same time still putting more people in.
Yeah, totally. You already spoke to this a bit, but can you tell us what you think is working and isn't working in terms of remediating the harms for people of color, although or those who have been incarcerated or impacted by the war on drugs?
So what I think, like has been working, there have been tremendous amounts of expungements. However, it's really just saying, sorry, we hurt you without actually healing the harm that was done. And so I do think that, we should take credit that we have done some pretty amazing stuff on the record clearance side of things and really starting to limit the collateral consequences. Where we have not done well is actually investing in the communities that were impacted in a way so that they're stronger afterwards. And that is where I think the work really needs to move into. I think the business side of cannabis has overtaken the conversation in such a way that it's been very detrimental to the movement to reinvest in the communities and get people out of prison. I support folks being able to start businesses and doing what they need to do, but that is not healing the war on drugs. All right. Like the amount of businesses that are going to go out there are going to heal the fact that millions and millions of people were impacted by arrest and incarceration. And so while that economic side is important, right? I think what has not worked for the movement, and in part, it didn't work because people moved into different spaces after they moved on, from the work they were doing. And it's the community investment side that really does need a sort of reinvigoration of advocate and activist talent to really push on that particular aspect of it. Because while we were able to secure funding through the equity bills and create these funds, once those funds were created, far too often that money did not go to the communities that we really wanted it to go to, specifically folks that were arrested, and very specifically communities that were over-policed, right? The over-policing happened in a geographic focus, right? There was literally red lines and green lines drawn around different communities that said, we are going to send more cops here and less cops over there, right? So we have the ability to look back and see how much money did we spend arresting folks in this community versus that community, and making sure that that money goes back to those communities. Where I think a lot of the academic folks could help us in this fight is that often those communities may not have the expertise to receive something like an RFP process that can be quite complicated and turn that into community and institutional change. So what ends up happening is they ask for rather small amounts of money that in an immediate sense can help folks with hosting an event, doing some education, but it's not actually going to uplift the entire community for generations to come. And so what I would really like to see is the academic community be able to partner with local organizations to say, how do you submit an RFP for $10 million that is going to create an institution in this community, like a community center that Chelsea was mentioning earlier, right? Like these actual entities, a building itself that houses services for folks that are desperately needed, and making sure that when we think about where these dollars are going to go, we can point to a very specific space that was created out of this effort that is sustainable, that has multi-focus on different types of programs for different types of people, and is very particular to that community that was over-policed, right? I think there are lots of different ways we can do that. There's schools, healthcare clinics, community centers, museums, right? I think there are a lot of different ways that we can do this, because on the museum side of it, I think it's really important that the community that is there also understand that the funding and the change that happened through resistance and learning what that looks like. And I think that there are a lot of ways that we can share that history so that as we move forward and we start to train folks in these different communities, they're trained in the art of resistance itself to be able to double down and build on the victories of the past. And so, again, there's lots of different ways we can do it. I think the biggest issue that we haven't been able to pull off is scaling up enough to actually make sure that the impact lasts for generations.
Thank you for your thoughts on that topic, Jason. My next question is for Scott. What do you think is the biggest obstacle legally to reparations or other remediatory measures?
Sure. So there are two constitutional issues that have come up in the context of social equity efforts, mostly with respect to business licensing preferences. So I'll go through both of those. The first is the Equal Protection Clause. So the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment is supposed to guarantee equal protection to all citizens, all people, sorry. And the Supreme Court, the kind of current iteration of the Supreme Court, has interpreted that to impose a rule of colorblindness, which is to say that any law that draws distinctions based on race is almost certainly going to be deemed unconstitutional, right? Any law drawing distinctions based on race is subject to what we call strict scrutiny, which is like the most stringent form of judicial review that the court has. And so with very, very minor exception, laws that draw distinctions based on race are unconstitutional. Now, this is, obviously a very great thing when it comes to laws that are designed to subjugate, right, one group of people over another. But where that principle's application is more controversial, and I think problematic, is when it comes to remedial laws, right? Laws that are designed to remediate a harm that society or that government brought upon a particular racial group. And obviously that's front and center, right, when it comes to rectifying the harms of cannabis prohibition. However, any law that allocates benefits on and uses race as one factor in allocating those benefits is going to be constitutionally suspect. That I wish that weren't so, but it is, right? And so that's a reality that we have to deal with in thinking about how are we going to structure social equity programs in this space. The other provision of the Constitution that has come up is a doctrine called the Dormant Commerce Clause doctrine. So first, like what the heck is the Dormant Commerce Clause doctrine? There, you can like flip through the Constitution. You will not find anything that says Dormant Commerce Clause. There is a clause called the Commerce Clause, And the Dormant Commerce Clause is like a judicially created principle that comes from the Commerce Clause. And it stands for the idea that basically states cannot engage in economic protectionism. States can't favor their own residents over non-residents when it comes to regulating commerce. So like the classic example, or one of the classic examples anyway, is like a lot of these cases, the early cases involve milk, like dairy production, right? So like if you're in Massachusetts, you can't favor Massachusetts dairy farmers and like prohibit dairy that comes from New York or from Connecticut or whatever, right? And so where this has come up in the cannabis industry is with residency restrictions on business ownership, right? So a lot of states at the beginning, they tried to keep their marketplaces insular and intrastate, right? And we still do this when it comes to interstate trade in actual cannabis product. But states wanted to, and many still want to, restrict ownership of cannabis businesses to just in-state residents. And courts across the country have invalidated many of these residency restrictions. That has included rules in the social equity context that give some sort of preference to in-state residents in business licensing. So the most recent case, or one of the most recent cases, and a very important case, came out of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. It reviewed a New York law that gave licensing preference to people who had cannabis convictions from New York State, right? So not any cannabis conviction countrywide, but you had to have a conviction that stemmed from, violating New York's cannabis laws. And in a nutshell, right, the court interpreted that as giving preference to New York residents, right? And furthermore, it rejected New York's argument that the state should be able to give licensing benefits to people it previously arrested and convicted for cannabis offenses, because New York has an interest, has an objective in providing restorative justice, right, to those people. And the Second Circuit Court of Appeals rejected that argument. In my view, that's like a tragically wrong decision. But again, like that's another like legal doctrine that we have to deal with when we're structuring our social equity programs. So, one way around that is to say, okay, like we're going to give licensing preferences to anyone with a cannabis conviction, regardless of whether it was in New York or elsewhere. Some states might not want to do that, right? Some states might be really focused on helping the people who the state specifically arrested, incarcerated, convicted, but other states might be open to like broadening the pool of applicants eligible for their social equity programs. So yeah, those are two obstacles that we have to deal with.
Chelsea, I wonder if you can chime in as someone working on federal reparations and combining those efforts with drug policy. What are the obstacles you see in that sense?
Thanks so much for this question. And I'll just piggyback a little bit off of what Scott just went over, and talking to specifically New York organizers and folks that were deep in those decisions. He mentioned that the court did not agree with New York's stance, that they had this duty of this reparative type of approach. And what we've heard from organizers there is that what might have made their argument stronger is from what they've interpreted, is to actually have that legislative intent in writing, that we are creating this bill because of these harms, this amount of people, and to be very, very clear about their argument and their case for making these moves. And so I just also wanted to bring that because we are continuing to be innovative and find solutions for our piece, as well as what he said, to expand it to be people offended across all states, which I think we can also all agree to. So the national reparations and national cannabis, repealing the prohibition pieces, I hate to talk about things that butt heads, but it's like I said, in any type of movement, is that we're still really working in silos. It's just been in the last few years that we've really started to get more conversation about how cannabis revenues can be created in a way to create like more contemporary reparations. And so now we have to do this combining of minds of sorts. There's still so much that I'm able to learn from the reparations movements because they do have what Jason was talking about, the Truth and Reconciliation. They have a bill that's proposed for this type of like deep study of the harm that's done, where we're still working on the full decrim of it, right? And I think that cannabis, even here in Virginia, like we're really proud to say that we have set up separate funds for money to meet our different needs. As Jason was talking about, like an individual fund for those impacted that might want to do licenses, okay, but also an individual, a reinvestment for the community. And then we also in Virginia have a public defense fund. All of that is built into 3 separate funds for people to get those petitions, the sealed. So we have that criminal justice piece, we have a community reinvestment piece, as well as support with like the licensing businesses piece. So I think reparations movements could also learn to how we've done some gatekeeping with the revenue. I think it's such an opportunity that cannabis has this decrim piece, but also creates its own revenue of resources that can be reinvested. Not all reparative methods can say that, right? And so I do think it is our duty to make sure, like Jason was saying, grab that money and make sure it's actually going back to the people that are harmed, because we don't normally really have this opportunity. So I just think that we're continuing to work in silos, but there's a lot of opportunity to learn from each other, and as well as to do like a greater good on this, while still holding the legacy of the longstanding reparations movements, and still being very urgent to what we're seeing and have opportunity to do right now. And like we say, really leave these breadcrumbs for organizers in the future to like how we were able to win some of these fights.
That's awesome. Thank you. So the next question I have is, there's been a lot of talk recently about rescheduling. Jason, can you tell us your thoughts on rescheduling and how it impacts criminal justice reform?
It would not help criminal justice reform whatsoever, actually. And so rescheduling would, for the most part, only help with a small tax write-off called 280E for a number of cannabis industry entities, right? Particularly dispensaries would benefit because it allows the cost of goods sold to be written off on their taxes. Now, rescheduling depends on exactly like how it's rescheduled and the different types of accompanying legislation, right? So President Biden initiated a process that was going to start a hearing over rescheduling, and was the recommendation loosely was Schedule 3. That would put it on par with ketamine. And so folks may see in their communities that ketamine clinics are available, right? However, they are highly regulated, and it is still criminal to possess ketamine that is not done through a, regulated entity. So rescheduling does not help us in most of the ways that we want to see advancement in criminal justice or business policies, because it will not actually protect the current medical or adult use industries from further enforcement. And quite frankly, opens up whole new doors for enforcement, right? Where the DEA and the FDA now have to figure out what type of enforcement they're going to have under a Schedule 3 regime. Could be nothing, could be radically ramped up, depending on how the administration wants to approach this particular moment. The other thing that I think is important, though, is that when Schedule 3 or any type of rescheduling happens, it does start the conversation around how are all the states going to adjust to this new world where it is Schedule 3. Again, they don't necessarily have to reduce criminal penalties. They could introduce new criminal penalties and make things more difficult for folks. Even with the hemp situation we saw in Texas, where they were trying to recriminalize hemp and make harsher penalties for hemp than they had for cannabis or marijuana. So rescheduling alone does very little, and it does very little beneficially. Specifically. Now, what I think it does do is it forces a national conversation on cannabis. That is where we as advocates can take advantage of this to push for the reforms that we want to see happening. It does give us the opportunity to go on the news, to go to communities, to get explain, hey, the federal government is shifting their approach to cannabis. They're admitting that it just simply was not as bad as decades of propaganda and lies have told us. So it is an opportunity for us to go out there and really push for things to strengthen our our equity programs to make sure that what we want is very clearly articulated and we're using the moment to demand further action than what rescheduling does inherently. So I look at it more as the opportunity to continue to push. We should take it as a victory that we created a political situation that was untenable the way it is and force change, but not sit on our laurels, right, and think that this is inherently going to do anything to benefit us. It's really a matter of how are we going to take advantage of this particular moment? And I think right now we can be developing legislation, programs, policies, all kinds of different pieces of community involvement that will say no matter what rescheduling does in the details, here's our ultimate goal, which is full descheduling, the full decriminalization of cannabis. And there are lots of places that rescheduling now allows us to then restart that fight for legalization, specifically the most of the South, right? I think that's where a lot of our energy should be focused in that once the federal government moves on this, there is less excuses from those folks that didn't want to see advancement happen. And we should leverage all the folks that already have adult use in their states, the half of the country that already has adult use, to support the work that is going to happen in the South to further decriminalize cannabis. But to be clear, rescheduling alone doesn't do that. It just creates an opportunity for us to work together to get the job done that we should have done a long time ago.
Chelsea or Scott, do you have anything you want to weigh in on that topic?
Just ditto to everything, to be very honest. It's really on the work of us to take advantage of this moment and to plan for our future.
Yeah, I'd also agree with Jason that like the primary benefit that would come from rescheduling is the potential catalyst for further change. Like my vision of kind of the best case scenario is like rescheduling happens and people realize it didn't actually change what they thought it was going to change, and now there's just like more push to change it. I just one other thing to add is like the unique legal status of cannabis after rescheduling it's going to be in a very odd and like one of a kind position, because it will be probably on Schedule 3 of the Controlled Substance Act, which is a schedule that is designed for drugs with approved medical uses. But the FDA also regulates drugs with approved medical uses, and the FDA will not say that it has an approved medical use. So it will be the only substance that is approved or in a category of drugs approved for medical use under one law, but not approved for medical use under the other law. And like, we just don't know quite what will happen with that because it's novel.
I think the other thing to also, when it comes to scheduling, cannabis is a plant. Most of the scheduled substances in Schedule 3 are individual molecules that are pharmaceutical medications. And so there are no full botanical plants, right, that are FDA approved for like a wide range of situations that the cannabis plant currently is. So it will be a very bizarre place. It is also possible that the cannabis plant remains in Schedule 1 and THC becomes Schedule 3, right? And that they start talking about individual molecules in the plant rather than the plant itself. And that will get really weird, right? Where you can own an extract that you got from a pharmaceutical company, but if you grow the plant in your house, it's still a felony, right? And so this is where like the details are really going to matter. And it is a weird position for the FDA to have a plant, like a whole plant get moved to Schedule 3. So that's where it's like, it kind of depends like how they react to this. If there's also supporting legislation that clarifies or complicates the situation that moves with it. So again, I think folks should really not look at this as like rescheduling will do X, Y, and Z. There's so many, it depends on the details that we really got to wait and see. I also want to just recommend folks like not hold their breath on rescheduling, right? Like continue to fight for full legalization this entire time because that's what we really want. It's what we really need. There is no reason to wait for rescheduling to fight for what we know we want already, because I personally don't think rescheduling is going to happen. I think it is smoke and mirrors. It is used to distract and delay us from our ultimate goal. So I think the best thing you can do in preparation for rescheduling or any other kind of change is to make it very clear what our ultimate goal is and continue to fight for that the entire time.
And I'm going to, particularly because this is the Parabola Center's platform, I'm just going to also mention something that may not always come up are the commercial determinants of health, basically like how commercials and businesses run and how that can impact our health. And so As we're continuing to go to Schedule 3, we're talking about medicinal, possibly think people are thinking big pharma. We just have to really remember what that means to certain monopolies and how they're going to be conducting their businesses and what they don't have to do to serve people that are consumers, the testing, things like that. So as we're continuing to fight at the federal level, I think it's going to also be important that we realize that running a bad business can also be bad for communities in a lot of different ways. So to keep that in mind as the holistic piece of that, Schedule 3 is not going to also help from these big monster companies coming in and destroying communities as well.
So finally, before we wrap up, I have one additional question, and I'll just pose this to the group at large. Under the current administration, where do you see the future of reparations and criminal justice reform for those convicted of cannabis offenses, especially in states that have now fully legalized?
And by administration, you mean this presidential administration?
Correct.
All right. Chelsea, feel free to start with that one.
Yeah, look, okay, so I'm in Virginia, all right, and right now we have an election that's coming up this November. And because of what's happening in the federal administration, people in Virginia are fired up. Okay, and so we're about to see what happens when people are really feeling that impact and come together. Because I believe in Virginia, we're about to flip our administration. We've had vetoed bills in Virginia for a long time, all through the Biden administration. So just like Scott was saying before about like different levels of government can have different wins, we have to find where our win is because there is always a win somewhere in our organizing movement, right? And so as we look at that, I think we keep the realities, keep our eye on what's happening at the federal level, because what Jason is saying was really true. Like they're creating a narrative with all this smoke and things, right? And we can kind of see and hear that just recently about older people, like that's coming up with a lot of folks with like Medicare. So something is going on there, but also continue to push here in Virginia. Because again, I think it's going to be important that we look at that overall and where we can have wins. Because not to be selfish, but in Virginia, if we're able to do some really important, innovative things, then that can trickle to other states as well as trickle up to better inform our federal bills. And so I'm really here to tell folks that this is a lifetime movement. We've seen this backtracking before, like it's actually just what happens, right? And so be deep in your reading, be deep in your community, like read some history, right? Because we wouldn't be here if that failed. So remembering that we're still moving forward, very, very much so. So don't get too discouraged about what you're seeing at the federal level, right?
Yeah, you can go first if you want. So, I think the benefit of this administration is that it is such an extreme example of what we do not want, that it's forcing local communities to figure out what the response is and who is going to be the leaders moving forward, right? So we have the midterm elections coming up. That's obviously going to be a point of resistance for, the left, generally speaking, right? Unfortunately, the Democrats have also shown that they are incapable of meeting this moment and having an actual resistance. And so I think what will end up happening is we're going to see lots of new folks coming to the table to say, I think I can do a better job than the current person that is leading us to nowhere, and a lot of primaries, right? And I think that is a good thing that in this midterm elections, we are hopefully going to primary a lot of folks that have been there for 20 or 30 years that don't have the fire necessary to meet this moment. And it's going to be in those conversations where we're pushing on the Democratic Party to propose real programs that things like reparations, universal basic income, all of these community investment, right? That it is no longer sufficient to just say Trump is bad. We know, right? It's very clear. And the pendulum has swung so far in that direction, and so little has come from the Democratic Party in actual resistance that it's just simply not a compelling argument anymore. And you need real plans and, and policies to put forward, right? If we look at Zoran in New York, he was very clear in his economic plan for exactly what he was going to do for New Yorkers, and he crushed it. He crushed the Democratic Party, I mean, when there is lots of folks that have been there for a long time. So I do think we are swinging into a space where we are going to have real concrete economic programs coming from folks that are going to primary Democrats and create a new resistance to this movement of deportations and intimidation, and like that stuff works for a time. And like Chelsea said before, right, like, but it doesn't last forever. Fascism has always fallen. Everywhere that it has started, it has fallen eventually. And so I do think as we move into next year, it is going to be the pendulum swinging back in the right direction. We're going to be able to have these very serious conversations about economic programs that can uplift our communities. And we're going to be in a space, in a moment where anyone who is really interested in being part of that movement and part of that resistance, there will be a place for you. So I do think, really do some gut checks, some internal soul searching of what it is that you want to do in this particular movement and this particular moment of resistance. Because in a few months here, we're going to see a real fight over the soul of the left, the soul of the country, and we're going to need every single person that cares about this country and our freedoms to really get involved. And it's going to be quite a battle. But the cannabis equity folks, the folks that have been fighting for cannabis justice for a very long time, we're in a space that is uniquely bipartisan, where we can use cannabis as an issue to discuss economic empowerment more broadly in a way that many other issues simply can't. So I do think we should take advantage of the fact that it is such a broad-based issue and turn that into a broad-based movement for economic empowerment across the country.
I mean, I'll echo all of that and everything Chelsea said. I'll give one more optimistic-ish view. I'm like an eternal optimist at a time when it's really hard to be. So I think that the pendulum swinging back and there being kind of a backlash to all of this mess is one optimistic view. The other narrower optimistic view when it comes to cannabis reform specifically is like there is a way to understand Trump and Trump's politics as like being almost purely transactional, where he will just like he will do things if he thinks it benefits him or his political future. And like maybe there's some universe where he believes it is transactionally beneficial to support some sort of reform. Like I'm not sure what that looks like, but he has in the past he has done some narrow things to support criminal justice reform. The First Step Act comes to mind. Mostly it seems like because somebody has gotten in his ear about that, or a particular person whose sentence should be commuted or he should be pardoned. So I don't know. Maybe there's some universe where there's like a transactional benefit to the president to enact cannabis reform. But the future probably is in the states and the cities. And I think I'm glad that there's so much energy there, and like really commend Jason and Chelsea and all the other people who are doing tremendous work on that front. If we get movement on the federal front in the next couple of years, that would be a wonderful bonus, but we can still work hard in the states and the cities.
Well, thank you all so much. I appreciate that we were able to end this conversation on a positive note. I do see that there were a number of questions asked and answered. If folks in the audience do have any outstanding questions that they urgently want our panelists to respond to, please send those in the chat in the next minute or so. But yes, I'd like to thank the three of you so much for your time today and all of your insights. It's been a really fabulous conversation. I know that I have a lot of notes that I've taken and am looking forward to doing some follow-up research on that end. I do see one new question here. A couple questions. How can or should cannabis entrepreneurs support reparations? As well as what can someone who isn't in policy do to help?
Chelsea, you can go first.
I'll just start with someone that isn't in policy. I think that the also really interesting and benefit to our movement is that a lot of consumers are very conscious, right? They know who's being able to sell to them, that sort of thing. Like, and many times, even if you're not in policy, you're here because you're a consumer in some sort of way, or have friends that are consumers, and you know that there's been a harm to that. And so this is again one of the things I say to just anyone that wants to be involved is to find the work that's happening locally. Follow the Parabola Center if you can't find those locally, and really then start to get involved and find where you fit in the movement, we need people from across all of disciplines. And so it's really great when people that show up to these types of webinars, because it shows how engaged you are, to come and be like, these are my skills. How can I offer that? How can I stand in the capacity that I have right now to assist here locally, but also, you know, larger. So it's also just doing that really fun work of finding yourself in the movement. And then the first part of the question, if you don't remind, I can look at it too, but if someone could say it out loud.
Yeah,
How do
how
business
can,
owners help? Okay.
yeah, go ahead, Jason. Yeah, business owners, how can they support reparations?
Yeah. So what I will say to this one directly is more to the businesses communities, particularly those that act in associations and larger numbers, is just to ensure that your demands aren't impacting those of other criminal justice type of efforts. A lot of times they can pin business versus justice efforts against us. And I know there are a lot of businesses are asked to like make donations and doing things like that. I'm also very aware that a lot of these businesses are not profitable anyway and may not be able to do those types of things. But that is when you have to be very conscious about where you are, what communities you are involved with, and to figure out what that could look like for you. But just be aware as a business owner, you are part of this capitalist system, right? That works. But the industry will be better to you when more people are also served better in the industry, right? And so just remembering that the more well-rounded we are in the community, the better your business will also be. So just ensuring that we're not thinking too individualized is what I really ask the business owner, and like see the larger industry structure as well.
Yeah, and I'll say to the folks that aren't currently involved in policy, like politics is definitely going to impact you whether you're involved or not. And so getting involved doesn't have to be one where you need a legal degree, right, to do this. We all have a number of different types of representatives, and they work for you. Your tax money pays their salaries and for their assistance, and you have the right to demand that they help you understand all of these different things that are happening to you in your community. You have a state representative, a state senator, a governor, a congressman, and a senator, right? All five of these people work for you. And one of the best things you can do is go to their fundraisers, go to their town halls, or go to their office and demand that they take action on the issues that are important to you. You can use some of the talking points that we gave you. We can also help you if you set up a meeting, actually join in some of those meetings with you, depending on where you are. And if they're virtual, that makes it a little bit easier. But remember, your state representative, your state senator, your governor, your congressman, and your senator, all five of these offices are there to help you. Contact all of them and ask them, what are you doing to help support cannabis equity in my community? What are you doing to make sure that there's economic development in my community? And pose the questions to them. Let them answer. They may say they're not doing anything, right? And then you get to decide what you want to do with that information. But one of the easiest things you can always do, call up your different representatives and ask them, why aren't you doing more for the things that I care about? And you don't really need to know any of the details to apply that pressure. And once you get that experience, ask all of your friends and family to do the same thing. Then you're building a movement that actually pressures folks to do things. And if you get to a point where you need assistance, call myself or Chelsea or Scott or any of the people that are on this webinar or in the movement. We're here for you to help you do that, to train you how to have these calls and make sure you're as effective as an advocate as you can be.
So I just want to add one more thing. And, I'm not qualified to give business advice, so please take this with a little bit of a grain of salt. But, I wonder if supporting reparations can be a differentiator for businesses in like a crowded marketplace, right? If you hold yourself out there as a company that supports reparations, and maybe you impose like, a dollar fee per transaction or something, and you say, hey, we donate this money to Last Prisoner Project, to Marijuana Justice, give it directly to people who were formerly incarcerated in the community, like whatever it is, maybe that can help you stand out as a business. And then it's a win-win, right? Where you're helping your business and you're helping this movement. And you know what, even better if we can get a whole like coalition of businesses who all want to do this, and they can brand themselves as supporting the reparations movement. Then we can just like circumvent the need for government, and like just, not that we should stop advocating for that, but if we can get a quicker win by getting support from industry, true real support from industry, then that would be a great way for business owners to help, in my opinion. I don't know if that's good business, so that's my caveat, but I hope it is.
Okay, well, we will end it there. Again, thank you to our panelists and thank you to all of you who joined to hear and be part of this conversation today.
Thank you all for being here, for supporting the movement up to this point, and looking forward to escalating with y'all over the next few years.
And thank you, everyone. Please follow us at marijuanajustice.org and THC Justice Now on social media. Thanks so much to the Parabola Center as well.
Yeah, I forgot. lastprisonerproject.org. Catch me on Instagram. Lots going on. All right, take care, everybody. Si se puede. We're going to get it done one way or another.